Once again, we appreciate everyone's presence this afternoon, especially our visitors, and we hope that you'll come back and be with us anytime that you have the opportunity to do so. Brother David said we want to continue this evening our series of studies from the Psalms, and tonight I've chosen to focus on Psalm 90. In a moment we'll read the entire psalm, but before we do, I'd like to point out some details that are found in the headings of the psalm. Depending on which version you are reading, before verse 1 of Psalm 90, we find some interesting notes. First of all, notice that this psalm is the first in what is known as Book 4. You may recall from Brother Nate's introduction to this series that the Psalms were originally collected into 5 books. And so the fourth book contains Psalms 90 through 106 and begins with verse 9, or rather Psalm 90. Next, at least in the New King James Version, there's a heading that gives the topic or the theme of this psalm. It says, the eternity of God and man's frailty. Other versions, such as the English Standard Version, the heading says, from everlasting to everlasting. Of course, these headings were added by the different translators to help us know what lies ahead in each chapter or in each book. And again, depending on which version you're reading, the heading may be worded differently. But from these headings, or from this heading, we can see what the theme of this psalm will be. And then finally, I want to point out what we see just before verse 1 here. Again, at least in the New King James Version, and I believe in several of the versions at least. It says that this is a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Now, if you're like me, that alone is very interesting. Moses wrote Psalms. I guess I always think of David as the main songwriter, if you will, and he did write a majority of them. At least 73 of the Psalms, we believe, were written by David, but there were other psalm writers too. And Moses, who of course lived hundreds of years before David, was one of those. Now, no one knows exactly when this particular psalm, Psalm 90, was written, possibly as early as 1500 BC. But you might be surprised to find that Moses actually wrote other psalms or songs that are found outside of this book. For example, Exodus 15. In verses 1 through 15, we find there what is titled the Song of Moses. And it's a song that he wrote, or a song that he sang at least, a song of triumph following the crossing of the Red Sea by God's people. And of course, the subsequent drowning of Pharaoh's army. It includes such familiar phrases as, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. You may remember those words or words similar to that from some of our own more recent songs. Again, in Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter, we find what is also titled the Song of Moses. This one is believed to have been written just before his death. It's a song of encouragement. He was encouraging the children of Israel to keep the law, even after they had entered into the land of Canaan. And then, of course, we have here our text, Psalm 90, which is called a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Now, it's interesting that this psalm or this song by Moses is actually a prayer. Out of the 150 psalms, only 5 of them have a title that says a prayer of so-and-so. 3 of those are from David, Psalm 17, 86, and 142. Another, Psalm 102, is simply titled a prayer of the afflicted. And then Psalm 90, a prayer of Moses. But regardless of the titles, as we studied in a previous lesson, many of the Psalms were actually written as expressions of praise and thanksgiving to God. Many of the Psalms were written to ask Him for His blessings or for His protection. In other words, many of the Psalms are in essence prayers meant to be sung, but prayers nonetheless. Some commentators also ascribe Psalms 91 through 100 to Moses. Others credit David or some other writer for these Psalms and believe that these Psalms were written many years later, even as late as the Babylonian captivity. But most agree that Psalm 90 was written by Moses. Now, notice I said that most agree. That's because there is actually some disagreement over this fact. Again, this title could have very well been added by the translators. And so, again, there are some who disagree whether this was written by Moses at all. The well-known commentator Adam Clarke, for example, did not believe that Moses wrote Psalm 90. He said that the title either was not authentic, was not original, and had been added, or he suggested that if it was, that this Moses must have been someone else by that name, that it could not have been the Moses, the Old Testament lawgiver that we know so well. As far as I can tell, though, Mr. Clarke based his opinion on one small detail that's found in verse 10 of Psalm 90. There it says that the life expectancy, more or less, of man is 70 years, or at most 80. We'll talk about that verse a little bit more later, but Adam Clarke argued that during Moses' time, men lived much longer than that. Moses himself, we're told, lived to be 120. His brother Aaron, 123. His sister Miriam lived to be 130. And so again, Clarke's argument was that how could Moses have written this if people were living much longer than 70 or 80? Well, personally, I don't think that's enough evidence to deny that Moses was the author of this psalm. Perhaps the average life expectancy was 70 or 80, in which case, understandably, there would be some who lived longer than that, even those who lived unusually long, like Moses and his siblings. After all, if there are any math nerds like me in the audience, that's the whole idea of an average. You have some numbers that are higher, and you have some that are lower, and somewhere in between you come up with an average. In fact, commenting on verse 10, Clarke himself admits that even during David's time, and I assume he thought that someone during David's time, or maybe David himself, must have written this psalm, but he admits that even during David's time, many lived 100 years, just as they do today in our time. And so Clarke seems to me to contradict his own argument that Psalm 90 couldn't have been written by Moses. Well, nevertheless, as I said, most agree that Moses was the author. And as such, this certainly makes it a very unique and a very interesting psalm to study. As I said, Moses is well known to most, if not all of us. And as we put into our minds, as we read this psalm, and we also think back on all that we know about Moses and all that he went through in his life and all the experiences that he had, I think it just adds even more meaning to the verses that we'll study tonight. That would also make it, by the way, the oldest psalm, at least in the book of Psalms, written by the oldest man in the post-Genesis era. And so let's begin by reading the psalm in its entirety. Psalm 90, verses 1 through 17. Psalm says, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn man to destruction and say, 'Return, O children of men.' For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, and like a watch in the night. You carry them away like a flood. They are like asleep. In the morning they are like grass which grows up. In the morning it flourishes and grows up. In the evening it is cut down and withers. For we have been consumed by your anger, and by your wrath we are terrified. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your countenance. For all our days have passed away in your wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Who knows the power of your anger? For as the fear of you, so is your wrath. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? And have compassion on your servants. O satisfy us early with your mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad according to the days in which you have afflicted us, the years in which we have seen evil. Let your work appear to your servants, and your glory to their children. And let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. I understand that this is the only psalm that begins with the respectful address of Lord, or in the original Hebrew, Adonai. And that word meant in the original Hebrew, master or sovereign, Lord, as it's translated in our modern translations. Moses said, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. A dwelling place is simply a place to retreat. It's a home. It's a refuge. It's a safe harbor. And I can't help but feel pity for Moses as he uses this image of home, because he had anything but a home. Here he was, a homeless pilgrim, a member of a homeless race. But he feels a sense of being at home, if you will, with God. And he says not just he, but all generations. Certainly this was true of the nation of Israel itself. Their faith in God dated back to the patriarchs. Generations of faithful believers, all the way from the days of Abraham. In fact, the years of Egyptian slavery had not destroyed even that faith. But God was there and our dwelling place throughout all generations. From the beginning of Adam's race, God has been the only hope of the human family. All generations, including our own, can and have found their only hope in God. And so again, I think that very first verse is very meaningful to us to realize that we only have a retreat, a refuge, a safe harbor in God. To take this point a little further, Moses goes on to say that God was in control even before man was ever created. As creator, before the mountains were formed, before the earth and the world itself were formed, God has been in control. Now, when we think of things such as the mountains and the world, those things to us seem to be eternal. They seem to have been around forever. And that's true, as long as time at least has existed. But there was, I started to say there was a time. Before time, they were not. But yet God was. From everlasting to everlasting, as Moses puts it here. That is, from the eternity before time began to the eternity when someday time will end. God has always and will always be. I like how one commentator put it here. He said, this is the highest description of the eternity of God that human language can reach. And I have to agree with him that Moses did a pretty good job of trying his best to explain the eternal nature of God. And what a reverent and a fitting way for him to begin this prayer, a lesson that I think we can learn when we too pray. Next, though, Moses turns from considering the eternal nature of God to comparing or contrasting really that with the frail and the fleeting nature of man. He says in verse 3, you turn man to destruction. Other versions, such as the ESV, say you turn man to dust. And surely this must be a reference to God's decree to Adam in Genesis 3 and verse 19, which, by the way, were words recorded by Moses himself. But of course, God told Adam, in the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Death and destruction of our mortal bodies is certain for us all. As the Hebrew writer puts it, it is appointed unto men once to die. Hebrews 9 and 27. But notice the second half of verse 3. After stating that God will turn us all to destruction, will return us all, if you will, back to dust, then Moses said that God will say, return, O children of men, children of Adam, as some versions have it. Now, it could be that Moses is just repeating. He's just emphasizing the thought that God returns us to dust. But one commentator pointed out that it is a bit strange here that Moses says God will perform the act, that he will turn us into dust, and then he will say the word or the decree. In other words, it would make more sense, it seems, if Moses had reversed the order, that God would say it and then he would do it. And so for this reason, some have suggested that perhaps the second half of this verse is referring to a different return. In fact, a return from dust instead of a return to dust might be a better translation. And of course, if that's the case, return from dust, then that would be a reference to the resurrection, when God will raise our bodies that may have already decayed back into the dust, but will raise us and give us a new body, a new life. And of course, if that's the case, that goes along perfectly with verse 4, where Moses seems to lament over how long it feels, to us at least, before we are reunited with God. He says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past." You know, time is such a relative thought. It's relative to the perspective from which one approaches it. From our perspective, from our human view, the time between our birth and our death and our eventual resurrection, well, it seems like 1,000 years. But from God's eternal perspective, it is but just a moment. And in verses 4 through 6, Moses illustrates this idea in at least five ways. First of all, he says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past." Again, I like how one commentator suggested that the phrase "when it is past" should instead be translated "when he has passed them." In other words, God, who was, after all, the creator of time, is still in control of time. Time itself is an action of God. And 1,000 years to God is but a drop in the bucket when compared to eternity. As we've seen, God has been since eternity past, and He will be in eternity future. And even though that's difficult for our feeble minds to grasp, I admit, we have to try to view our short mortal lives as well as our eternal spiritual existence in that light, in God's idea of time. Peter would later reference this verse in 2 Peter 3, verse 8, when he said, "But beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day." Simply put, God does not measure time the same way that we do. Secondly, the psalmist here in these verses compares this idea to a watch in the night. He says it's like a watch in the night. History tells us that a night watch would last for 3 hours. And someone has suggested that our lives can similarly be divided into 3 parts. We have our youth, when we are young. We have our middle age, maybe the majority of our life. And then we have our old age. And while it's true that the longer we live, the faster time seems to fly, when we put it in this perspective, our entire lives are just like 3 short periods, like a 3-hour watch in the night. And that's all the more reason that we need to make the best of the short time that we have. Again, Moses here compares our short lives to the waters of a flood. He says, "You carry them away," speaking about God, "you carry them away like a flood." Again, our lives certainly rush by, just like floodwaters that sweep through and suddenly carry everything with them. Or put another way, our lives are like floodwaters that rise and then fall, and then they're over. Or someone has pointed out that perhaps he's pointing here to the waves of the sea. Generations of men rise and fade away, just like the waves of the sea come and go. Whichever of those versions of a flood you choose, they all paint a good picture, again, of how fleeting our lives are. The fourth comparison here is to sleep. He says that our lives are like a sleep or a dream, as other translations have it. And in one way, this is quite literal. We do spend as much as a third of our lives doing just that, sleeping. But I also think that we can all appreciate and we can relate to this in a figurative sense. How often have we looked back on our life and thought how it all just seems like a dream? It seems to have gone by so fast. And the years of our past life are just a memory. Some of the details may be vivid, but others are just like a blur, like a dream that we can't quite capture. Again, that's because of the shortness and the frailty of our lives. And then finally and fifthly, he compares our lives to grass. He says, in the morning they are like grass, which grows up. In the morning it flourishes and grows up. In the evening it is cut down and withers. And once again, we kind of see an allusion here to our youth, which would be the morning of our lives, and the midday or the middle age of our lives, and then the evening, which would be our old age. Just like the grass, in the end, our life either naturally fades away or it's cut off suddenly. You know, Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, referenced the grass of the field. He said, which today is, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven. Matthew 6 and verse 30. Peter, too, speaking about God's Word, would write in 1 Peter 1, verses 24 and 25, all flesh, our bodies, all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of the grass. Grass withers, and its flower falls away, but the word of the Lord endures forever. And so in these very vivid illustrations, these 5 ways of describing how brief our lives are and how certain our deaths are, Moses then begins in verse 7 to remind us of the reason for this, the reason for our death, the reason for our destruction, the reason that we return to dust. Before we notice that reason, though, I did want to point out one other detail. I'm told that the verb form for the original word that's translated here in verse 3 as destruction or dust, that verb or that word is elsewhere translated as in such words as crushed, Job 4 and 19. Destroy, Job 6 and 9. Break in pieces, Job 19 and 2. Broken, Job 22 and 9. Again, all of those phrases or words come from the same word, which is here translated as destruction or dust. And that's a very vivid and quite frankly, a very violent and frightening description of our death. But from Psalm 90, beginning with verse 7, we can see, again, the reason for this, the reason for our death. And it is that it is a result of God's righteous judgment and His punishment of our sin. In the NIV, there are 3 words used in these verses that illustrate God's feeling towards sin. Anger, indignation, which in the New King James Version is translated as wrath, and then wrath. But again, those 3 words, anger, indignation, wrath. Think about that's how God feels towards our sin. Hebrews 10 and 31 says it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. But as one commentator notes from verse 11, it's almost as if Moses gives up trying to understand and trying to put into words just how much God hates sin. He says in verse 11, who knows the power of your anger? Who knows how to describe how much you hate and are angry at sin? Death is not something that just naturally comes to us because of sickness or disease or even the eventual wearing out of our bodies. Death was not the original plan. Death, instead, is a result. It's an effect. It was the result of man's sin. Romans 6 and 23 says very plainly that the wages of sin is death. And again, in the beginning, it was not God's plan for man to die at all. As Brother Daniel described this morning, Adam and Eve had a perfect life at their fingertips. But God warned them of the consequences of sin. And they ignored God's warning, and they disobeyed Him anyway. And thus death entered the world. That's why babies die. Sometimes we hear people say, how could a God, if He's loving and merciful, how could He allow an innocent baby to die? That's why innocent children die. Because again, when sin entered the world, death entered the world. But for those of us who have reached the age of accountability, of course, we bear the guilt as well. Romans 3:23 reminds us that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Moses makes this clear in verse 8 when he says, "You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins, in the light of your countenance." There's no sin that goes unnoticed by our righteous judge. The commentator James Kaufman notes, he says, men do not generally take the anger and wrath of God seriously enough. The current conception of God in our American society regards him as a rather overindulgent grandfather who pays little or no attention to the crimes of blood and lust that rage beneath his very nose, assuming that his wonderful loving grace and mercy will ignore and overlook anything that wicked men may do. How true that is. How else could we explain things such as the millions of lives that are lost to abortion each year? How else could we explain it other than we don't understand how angry, how displeased it makes God? And all the while we ignore the seriousness of sin, and we ignore how short our time on earth really is. Verses 9 and 10 say, "For all our days have passed away in your wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away." I wanted to make a couple more observations about Moses' comments here on life expectancy being 70 or 80. As I said earlier, some have used this to dispute the fact that Moses was the author of this psalm, since he lived to be 120. But I think one easy explanation to that could be that perhaps when he wrote the psalm, he had no idea that he would live that long. Many believe that the psalm was written toward the end of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness that the children of Israel experienced, and that's quite possibly true. That would have been just before the promised land was finally inherited, and of course near the end of Moses' life, and so he would have been well on in age, well over 100, if that's the case. But others believe that this psalm could have been written instead toward the end of his exile in Midian. Remember, he had killed an Egyptian, and for fear of his life, he fled to the land of Midian. Of course, that's where he met his wife. But according to Acts 7 and verse 23, and also verse 30, if that's the case, he would have been about 80 years old at that time. And so, again, we can see where he would be saying the lifespan of man is 70 or perhaps 80 in his own case. Also, it's possible that if this psalm was written at the end of the wilderness wandering, then you remember God had decreed that all of the Israelites who were above the age of 20 at the Red Sea crossing would die during that 40 years, except, of course, for Caleb and Joshua. In other words, the average lifespan of God's people at that particular time of the children of Israel was much less than Moses and his siblings, because they all died, at least all the adults died, within that 40 years to come. Well, regardless of where you stand on this debate, we shouldn't miss the point of verse 10, and that is that our life is short. Our days are numbered. And so, beginning in verse 12, Moses pleads with God to help us to have this realization, to realize how short our days are. He asks for the wisdom to number our days. And I don't think that's just asking to know how many days we have left, but instead to be able to appreciate them and use them wisely. Not just to cross out our calendar, but to commit our days to the Lord. Not just to wait for death, but to work out our life, to work each day to please God more and more. He pleads for God to have compassion and mercy upon His children, to show them as many good days as they have bad. And again, whether this was Moses thinking about the years that his people had been enslaved in Egypt as he was currently in Midian, or if it was the years that they had spent wandering in the wilderness. Either way, he asks for a blessing of God's work and His glory and His beauty in their lives. Not only God's work, but also a blessing on the work that they themselves would do in God's service. And in closing this afternoon, I'd like to read these verses again, but this time I'd like to read them from the New Living Translation. Psalm 90, verses 12 through 17 from the NLT says, "Teach us to realize the brevity of life so that we may grow in wisdom. O Lord, come back to us. How long will you delay? Take pity on your servants. Satisfy us each morning with your unfailing love, so we may sing for joy to the end of our lives. Give us gladness in proportion to our former misery. Replace the evil years with good. Let us, your servants, see you work again. Let our children see your glory. And may the Lord our God show us His approval and make our efforts successful. Yes, make our efforts successful." What a beautiful prayer this is. It's one that I think we can learn a lot from to apply to our own lives and perhaps to apply to our own prayers. And I hope that the study this afternoon has been beneficial to everyone. We never end a service without offering the gospel invitation. If there's one here tonight who has never taken the steps of belief, repentance, confession, and baptism for the forgiveness of your sins, then certainly there's no better time than the present. And as this psalm has proven to us, we don't know how much longer we have. And so, again, with the opportunity right in front of you, we encourage you to take that step tonight. If you've once taken those steps, but you have not remained faithful, then you too do not know how much longer you have to make those things right. And so, through repentance and confession and prayer, make whatever those things are right with God today. If we can assist you in any way, please come while we stand and while we sing.